Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, DeWanda Wise realises that her stepdaughter's imagination is taking a sinister turn in Blumhouse's Imaginary. Children's book illustrator Jessica, played by DeWanda Wise, moves back into her childhood home with her new rock star husband Max, played by Tom Payne, and his children Alice and Taylor, played by Piper Braun and Tegan Burns respectively. Soon after, Alice finds hidden in the basement a stuffed teddy bear named Chauncey, who quickly becomes her imaginary friend. But Jessica starts to become alarmed at Alice's unsettling behaviour and discovers secrets from her own past that make her realise that the threat from Chauncey is definitely not imaginary. Blumhouse's low-budget model has come to dominate the horror genre for the last decade or so, and when it works, it can produce some great movies. You think of things like Get Out or Megan, and those hits allow you to overlook the plentiful misfires that Blumhouse has released over the years. But even many of those were quite commercially successful, because often the budgets for these films are so low that they make their money back in the opening weekend. That's pretty lucrative from a production point of view, but in terms of the films themselves, Blumhouse has been on a bit of a cold streak of late. First, there was the terrible Five Nights at Freddy's movie, a massive disappointment given how long that was in development hell. Then we had Night Swim back in January, which almost functioned as being a self-parody of a Blumhouse movie. Now we have Imaginary, and you don't need to have a vivid imagination to work out what kind of Blumhouse movie it is, especially when you look at the CV of who's involved with it. The film is directed by Jeff Wadlow, who for Blumhouse has directed Truth or Dare and Fantasy Island, and before that he also directed Kick-Ass 2. So not exactly the greatest of CVs, especially considering that Fantasy Island and Truth or Dare might be contenders for some of the worst films that Blumhouse has ever released. An uncredited writer on this movie, by the way, is Bryce Maguire, who is the writer and director of the aforementioned Night Swim. He was also a writer on Baghead, which I saw recently, and I need to do a video on that because that's a whole other can of worms right there. But I bring up Night Swim because I literally watched that the night before I did Imaginary. Effectively, I did a Blumhouse double feature, and watching the two movies back to back, it's really striking how similar the two films are in many different ways. It becomes clear that Blumhouse hasn't just got a formula for how they make the movies, but often just what happens in them. They've codified horror tropes to such an extent that Blumhouse is just effectively making an assembly line of PG-13 multiplex fodder horror movies, and that's not good for anyone's imagination. The frustrating thing about Imaginary is that it has a genuinely great idea at the centre of it. A horror movie centred around imaginary friends, you could do so much with that idea. You could do a genre spin on Drop Dead Fred. That was almost a horror movie to begin with. There's literally no limits with it aside from the filmmaker's imagination and their budget. And even with the realms of a Blumhouse budget, they could still be off the wall and subversive, really playful with it if they wanted to be. But it's pretty clear watching Imaginary that the filmmakers didn't want to do that, and instead took that idea and just fed it through the Blumhouse find and replace in terms of its script. And it's not like Night Swim, which had an absolutely ridiculous concept of a haunted swimming pool and has to contrive ways of keeping people around it and takes itself so absolutely seriously. There are moments where Imaginary, just for the briefest of moments, almost shows some signs of life, a sign of a sense of humour on occasion. There's a moment where DeWanda Wise literally exclaims, "I'm gonna have to kill that bear." But the movie almost feels like it's refusing to have any fun with the central idea. Unfortunately for Imaginary, most of the funny parts are the distinctly unintentional variety, and it'll be coming from the experienced horror fans that have seen a version of this movie 6 billion times before. The film is so risibly cookie cutter, and I know that's a bit of a harsh criticism to make, because often these Blumhouse movies are made for teenagers. The PG-13 rating on them means that they can be the gateway for those to get into the horror horror genre, but even with that, I don't think that's an excuse for these movies because they're not good enough. They're just not scary. They're basically the horror genre equivalent of walking into Nando's and ordering a mild. Like, what's even the point of going in the first place if you're not even getting a hint of spice with it? Okay, here's a question for you. Aside from being Blumhouse movies, what do this, Five Nights at Freddy's and Night Swim all have in common? Don't know the answer? I'll tell you the answer, is that they all have long stretches of absolutely nothing happening in them. And this isn't to be confused with building tension, because this isn't that. That would imply that there's a purpose to what's happening on screen. The cheapest thing you can do is just have characters wandering around and talking and expositing. And guess what? All three of these movies have long stretches where nothing is really happening. They're just filling out time until the point where they can actually start using up their budget. And it's really frustrating, especially because in the case of Night Swim and Imaginary, whole swaths of the movie take place in broad daylight, which is one of the hardest things for a horror movie to build suspense in, because there is so much natural light blasting in through the windows that you can see everything. You can't hide anything. And so a lot of the time, the movie is literally trying to build suspense with maybe a slight stinger in the soundtrack whilst having a close-up of a teddy bear, like a lost count of how many times Imaginary kept cutting to the teddy bear, as if we were meant to be frightened just on sight by a teddy bear that actually doesn't even look remotely sinister. It just kind of looks vaguely sad-faced a lot of the time. It's not even creepy, it's just a teddy bear. Much of what happens in the first half of Imaginary is just textbook stalling. It's just delaying. It's just holding back the flow of information just to make itself longer, even though it's stuff that the audience would have already guessed. Take, for example, the fact that Jessica moves back into her childhood home. We know it's her childhood home, she knows it's her childhood home, but she doesn't remember actually living there because she moved out when she was 5, and apparently that means that she can't remember anything of what happened there. This is awfully convenient because that means that she doesn't realise that the imaginary friend that her stepdaughter is interacting with is the same imaginary friend that she was interacting with when she was a child. And so this means that the audience is about 15 steps ahead of the movie, because the film tries to present this as being some kind of twist, as some kind of big reveal in the narrative, even though it is literally something the audience would have probably assumed from about the split second she stepped in the house. We know exactly where this is going to go, and the movie refuses to offer any kind of real surprises on that front. And instead, you end up just kind of waiting for the film to finally catch up with where you were already at 45 minutes ago. So what does the movie do when there's nothing scary happening on screen? Cheap jump scares, of course. In fact, that's the very note the film starts off with. It starts off with a cheap fake-out dream sequence that looks like the cold opener to a lot of these Blumhouse movies that shows the previous victim of the film's central threat, just to build them up as being a terrifying entity. In this case, no, it's just a nightmare that Jessica is having, and it's meant to set up these various different things like her institutionalized father, and then she gets attacked by a giant spider thing, except there's so little context for the audience that it makes no sense for them except retroactively when they think back upon the movie later. That's always a great way of establishing things to an audience, I found. Likewise, there is also the stepchildren's birth mother who herself has also been institutionalized, and there is a moment where her character breaks out and just appears for a cheap jump scare, and this is meant to set up for later. The problem is, the movie didn't actually tell us what she looked like until this moment. We get jump scared by a woman that we've literally never seen before, and then are meant to realise, oh, that was the birth mother. You know, great way of conveying information to the audience. You know, you couldn't shown a picture beforehand so he knew who this woman was, instead of me just spending a split second going, who the hell is that meant to be? Where is this woman just suddenly materialised from? Great filmmaking right there. But my personal favourite of these is the boy next door that Taylor, the elder stepdaughter, brings round to the house, a combination of empty padding and cheap jump scares. The character literally only exists for a 10-minute sequence or so where he wanders round the house, occasionally getting jump scared by Chauncey. He uses the upstairs toilet, and while he's peeing, the shape of the teddy bear appears in the towel, which distracts him midstream. Then he gormlessly follows around the incredibly long pull string that Chauncey has to get jump scared again. And then that character leaves the house and effectively leaves the rest of the movie. We almost never see him again, apart from one very brief moment where Taylor is wandering around on the streets, she sees him in his bedroom, and he just closes the blind. That's the entire payoff for that character and that whole sequence. Wow, this character didn't need to be in the movie in the slightest. It's pretty ironic that a movie called Imaginary is so strikingly derivative. In fact, let's do a list of all the things that Night Swim and Imaginary both have in common. They both have characters moving their families into a new home, which turns out to have a secret past. For a time, it seems to be benign, and they think the supernatural entity might even be helping them. You got Wyatt Russell's baseball character, who thinks the pool is helping with his MS. In Imaginary, Jessica thinks that the house is helping with her designing skills, although in actuality, that plot point gets dropped almost as soon as it's brought up to begin with. But it turns out that actually it's targeting their children and wants to take them away to another realm, and that applies to both movies. But even weirder similarities, like in Night Swim, there is a moment where a character draws a smiley face on a coin, and that turns out to be a Chekhov's gun that comes back in the finale of the movie. And now, in Imaginary, we have a character that draws a smiley face on a bouncing ball that comes back at the climax of the movie. It's very weird that that specific smiley face detail has appeared in two Blumhouse movies released 2 months apart. Often Imaginary actually feels like a grab bag of a load of things that Blumhouse has already done in many of their hit movies before. The relationship with the younger stepdaughter and Chauncey is very reminiscent of the similar dynamic that was in Megan, only very recently. But most striking of all is the similarities between Imaginary and Insidious, in that both movies feature characters that move back into their childhood homes where they don't realise they had a supernatural encounter at a young age, and then realise that same entity is targeting their children and wants to bring them over to the other side, or that never ever in the case of Imaginary. In fact, Imaginary borrows so much from that movie it could almost be considered a loose remake in many ways, right down to the fact that we have an expert character. In that film it was played by Lynn Shay, here it's played by Betty Buckley doing her best Lynn Shay impression. In fact, Buckley is probably best known to modern viewers as co-starring in Split, another Blumhouse production that's far better than this one. Buckley is clearly enjoying getting her 10 minutes of screen time as the nosy neighbour who used to be Jessica's babysitter back in the day, and since then has become obsessed with the world of imaginary friends, delivering absolutely ridiculous exposition. There is a whole scene where she just comes out with utterly absurd nonsense, and even the film has to lampshade it as basically making her character a kook. Even so, Buckley is clearly enjoying getting to play this kind of offbeat character, and again, if the movie kind of leaned into that sort of thing, it would have been a lot more enjoyable than it is. And there is a lot of non-Blumhouse movies that it's also clearly derivative of. You think of things like Annabelle or Child's Play, but the fact that Blumhouse is so obviously cribbing from their back catalogue is actually really astonishing. It feels like Blumhouse has actually managed to somehow cannibalise itself. And it's not really the fault of the actors who are trying to do their best with the often terrible dialogue. I especially feel bad for the kid playing Alice, who has spent a lot of her screen time doing her best Gollum impression in her interactions with Chauncey, which are more funny than scary. I also feel quite bad for the one playing the elder step stepdaughter who is just playing a stuck-up brat who hates her stepmother. Never seen that in a horror movie before. But it's one thing to be dull and derivative, it's another to insult the audience's intelligence. There's a twist at around halfway through the movie that is absolutely unbearable. It's a twist that I didn't see coming, because it's completely stupid. It makes absolutely no sense and opens up a whole bunch of plot holes in the process. It's also the kind of twist that if you took it out of the movie, it really wouldn't have mattered either way. It adds very little to the film. It's only in the final act, when they jump over into the Never Ever, does the film finally show any kind of imagination, and I actually found myself wishing that more of the film took place here, or they actually jumped over an earlier point and actually took more advantage of it. But even then, it's largely just a generic fun house, a cavalcade of doors that lead into rooms of very conventional varieties. And that's a shame, considering the movie sets up that this is a world of imagination. It sets up the possibility that the characters can generate scenarios out of their own minds, and so you can have things that are both dreams and also nightmares simultaneously. Again, you could do anything you want with this setup, and mostly it's just generic horror stuff. Worse still, the design of Chauncey, the horror version of it, feels like just a rejected Freddy Fazbear from Five Nights at Freddy's. It feels like a reused concept design more than anything. But even then, it feels like, again, it's mostly just a mild horror movie riff on Coraline more than anything, especially given the recurring image of characters with their eyes replaced with teddy bear black eyes, which is very reminiscent of the black buttons that the characters stitched in their eyes in that movie. And it's really striking that a PG-rated film like Coraline actually feels more sinister than a movie like Imaginary does, ostensibly aimed at adults. I do have to give the movie credit for one thing though, it doesn't end on a stupid nihilistic last-minute twist like so many Blumhouse horror movies do, that just ends the movie on a completely sour note. In fact, it actively subverts that. It sets that up and it looks like it's going to be the film's ending, and then it turns out there's another 10 minutes of the movie to go. And I actually give the movie points for not following through on that. Unfortunately, it has the side effect of making it feel like the climax of the movie is never going to end, because it has not just one, but two false finishes, and it gets exhausting by the time the movie finally actually bothers to wrap itself up. Here's a little tidbit for you. Universal actually has a first look deal with Blumhouse to distribute their movies, and they passed on releasing Imaginary. Imagine that! That's the reason why Lionsgate is putting this out and not them, and I think that pretty much says it all. This is subpar by Blumhouse standards. It is so formulaic and so derivative, even among the studio's back catalogue, that it feels like a squandering of a great idea. Even teenagers are going to think that this is an anemic horror movie. It's not scary even once. And I think it's become pretty clear after the last several movies that Blumhouse needs to tear up their formula and actually start trying to be creative again. If you like this video and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. You can unlock the full power of my imagination though at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, or you can sign up to YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.